That Tuesday morning, I was called into the conference room to be erased. Blake slammed a file onto the table. "You are under internal investigation," he announced. Outside, coworkers averted their eyes like I was contagious. But Blake missed one fatal detail: I never truly worked for his company. My single phone call wasn't to beg a lawyer. It was to my real employer, letting him know our prey had just pulled the trigger on his own trap. My name is Morgan Allen, and until 10:15 on a thoroughly unremarkable Tuesday morning, I was known simply as a mid-level reimbursement analyst at Holloway Benefit Systems in Columbus, Ohio. I sat in a gray fabric cubicle, drank terrible break room coffee, and processed medical and travel expense claims for injured workers. That was the illusion. Anyway, the reality was that I was a ticking time bomb buried deep inside their corporate architecture, and the countdown had just unexpectedly skipped ahead. The summons came through a sudden ping on my internal messaging system. Blake Harlan, the regional operations manager, requested my presence in the main glass-walled conference room immediately. There was no context attached to the message, no agenda, just a hard, non-negotiable demand. As I stood up and walked down the main aisle of low-walled desks, the ambient noise of clacking keyboards and murmured phone calls seemed to thin out. By the time I reached the heavy glass door of the conference room, I knew exactly what kind of theater I was walking into. I pushed the door open. The air inside was stifling, thick with the smell of dry erase markers and the sharp scent of nervous sweat masked by cheap cologne. Blake sat at the head of the long mahogany table. To his right sat a woman from Human Resources, her hands neatly folded over a yellow legal pad. To his left were 3 senior analysts, people I had shared turkey sandwiches and office complaints with just 24 hours prior. Now they were rigidly staring at the grain of the wood table, avoiding my gaze like I carried a highly contagious disease. Blake stood up as the door clicked shut behind me. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, adopting a posture that practically screamed manufactured authority. He cleared his throat, locking his dark eyes onto mine with a look of profound, entirely synthetic disappointment. "Morgan, please have a seat," Blake said, his voice dripping with that specific brand of professional concern they teach in middle management defensive leadership seminars. I pulled out a heavy leather chair and sat down, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I did not ask why I was there. I did not feign confusion. I simply let him fill the silence, watching his eyes dart momentarily to my still hands. "It deeply saddens me to have this conversation today," Blake began, leaning his knuckles on the table to loom over my seated position. "But over the past 48 hours, our internal security sweeps flagged several highly concerning anomalies tied directly to your specific login credentials." He paused, clearly waiting for me to gasp, widen my eyes, or stammer a desperate defense. When I offered nothing but a calm, unblinking stare, a faint twitch appeared at the corner of his jaw. The script was already going wrong for him. He pushed forward, his tone abandoning the fake pity and sharpening into an accusatory strike. "We have a permanent server log showing you accessing claimant records completely outside the scope of your assigned region. You initiated unauthorized back-end data queries. Furthermore, you transferred highly sensitive operational files to segmented internal drives without management approval. These are egregious violations of our company security protocols. Morgan, frankly, if we look at the pattern, it borders on corporate espionage." The silence in the room became absolute. The air pressure seemed to drop, making the room feel incredibly small. I glanced at the senior analysts. One of them, a man who had shown me pictures of his golden retriever just yesterday afternoon, swallowed hard and shifted his chair back a few inches. He was literally distancing himself from the blast radius. It was a classic corporate execution. It was public. It was humiliating. And it was deliberately designed to isolate the target entirely. The unspoken message to the rest of the room was crystal clear: if you stand near her, you go down too. Blake reached into a manila envelope resting next to his keyboard and pulled out a crisp, white document. He slid it across the smooth wooden table until it stopped right in front of my folded hands. "This is a formal admission of fault and a non-disclosure termination agreement," Blake explained, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial register intended to sound like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Given the severity of your actions, Holloway would be entirely within its legal rights to involve law enforcement and press federal charges. However, we prefer to handle these unfortunate lapses in judgment internally. If you sign this right now, we will agree to a quiet separation. We will even provide you with 2 weeks of severance pay to help you transition out of the company. But you must leave this building immediately, and you do not speak a single word of this to anyone, ever. I looked down at the paper. The font was standard. The legal jargon predictable and overly broad. They wanted me out. They wanted me silenced. And they wanted me permanently discredited. But as I sat there, reading the bold black headings of the termination clause, I felt absolutely no panic. Instead, a cold, clinical realization washed over me. I felt a dangerous deviation in the rhythm of our operation. This was happening exactly 3 weeks earlier than my timeline projected. I had been incredibly careful. My data pulls were masked, fragmented, and buried under dozens of layers of routine audits. A standard internal sweep would never have caught me, not unless they were specifically looking for a ghost in the machine. I raised my eyes from the paper and looked closely at Blake. Beneath the aggressive posturing, beneath the perfectly combed hair and the sharp suit, the man was sweating. His pupils were slightly dilated. His breathing was far too shallow for an executive who had simply caught a rogue junior employee. He was not just suspicious, he was terrified. That meant someone far above Blake Harlan's pay grade had noticed a loose thread in their financial tapestry. The massive acquisition deal for Holloway Benefit Systems by Kincaid Meridian Holdings was supposed to close in less than a month. The people at the very top were desperate to sweep the floors clean before the buyers brought in their own aggressive forensic auditors. Blake was just the blunt hammer they were using to smash the problem before it could shatter their multi-million-dollar buyout. "You are very quiet, Morgan," Blake noted, clearly mistaking my analytical silence for shock. He leaned over the table, bringing his face closer to mine, trying to physically dominate my space. "You need to understand the absolute gravity of your situation. You have zero leverage here. I am the one who decides your future in this company, and frankly, your future in this entire industry. Sign the paper, take the 2 weeks of pay, walk away before I change my mind." I did not reach for the pen. I leaned back in my chair, uncrossing my legs and resting my hands comfortably on the armrests. I let a long, agonizing 5 seconds pass before I finally spoke. "I have one request before I make any decisions regarding this document," I said, my voice entirely devoid of the trembling fear he expected to hear. "I need to make exactly one phone call." Blake let out a short, harsh laugh. He looked at the HR representative, sharing a quick smirk of shared superiority. He assumed I was about to call an overworked legal aid lawyer, or perhaps a terrified family member to cry about my lost job. He thought a phone call would only cement my desperation and speed up the signing process. "Go ahead," Blake sneered, waving his hand dismissively toward my pocket. "Make your call. But I promise you, no one is going to save your job today." I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out my mobile phone. I unlocked the screen, dialed a highly encrypted external number I knew by heart, and pressed the speakerphone icon. I set the phone gently onto the center of the mahogany table, right next to the termination agreement. The line rang once, twice. "Nolan Pierce," a voice answered. The audio quality of the speakerphone was exceptionally clear, projecting his voice into the dead, heavy silence of the conference room. Blake frowned, his smug expression faltering slightly as he tried to mentally place the name within the company directory, and failed. I leaned forward, speaking clearly and deliberately toward the device. "Mr. Pierce, this is Morgan. They have just pulled me into the conference room and initiated a formal internal investigation against me." I paused, making direct eye contact with Blake. I watched the color begin to slowly drain from his face as the confidence of my tone hung in the air. "I think we can go ahead and suspend observation mode now," I stated evenly. There was a brief moment of silence on the other end of the line. When Nolan Pierce spoke again, His voice was no longer that of a casual administrative contact. It was cold, metallic, and carried the crushing weight of absolute authority. It was the voice of a hunter who had just been handed the precise coordinates of his prey. "Ms. Allen, thank you for the confirmation," Pierce replied, his words cutting through the stagnant air of the room like a steel blade. "The legal hold and data preservation order are now fully activated across their entire network. As of this exact moment, no one in that room is investigating you anymore." I reached out and ended the call. The sharp beep of the disconnecting line echoed loudly off the glass walls. I did not move. I simply sat there, watching Blake Harlan finally realize that the trap he thought he had set for me was actually the cage I had just locked him inside. I was never supposed to be sitting in that gray fabric cubicle, drinking stale coffee and pretending to care about the office politics of a mid-level benefits management firm. I was not a mid-level reimbursement analyst desperate for a middle management promotion, nor was I someone who derived any satisfaction from perfectly formatted spreadsheets. My actual title was Financial Compliance Investigator for the Sterling Vale Integrity Group. We were a private intelligence and forensic accounting firm that operated entirely in the shadows of high finance. Our current client was Kincaid Meridian Holdings, the corporate giant preparing to swallow Holloway Benefit Systems whole. When a massive conglomerate is about to spend $800 million on an acquisition, they do not simply read the glossy financial brochures provided by the seller. They hire people like me to dig through the digital trash, check the accounting floorboards for rot, and find the liabilities buried deep within the ledger. My mandate was highly specific and entirely confidential. I was not sent there to sabotage Holloway or to leak trade secrets to their competitors. Kincaid Meridian had simply noticed minor persistent anomalies in Holloway's medical reimbursement and worker rehabilitation benefit payouts during their preliminary, high-level audits. The numbers were deeply confusing. They looked like tiny, insignificant rounding errors, scattered across tens of thousands of individual user accounts. Kincaid needed to know if they were buying a company with a sloppy procedural infrastructure or if they were inheriting a massive, legally actionable liability. They needed to know, definitively, if the lost money was a technical glitch or a deliberate feature of the system. To find the answer, Sterling Vale placed me inside Holloway as a long-term contract employee. I used my real name, Morgan Allen, to ensure my background check would pass any standard human resources screening flawlessly. I had a verifiable history in corporate accounting, which was completely true and easily confirmed. What we meticulously scrubbed from existence was any digital or paper trail connecting me to Sterling Vale or to our client, Kincaid Meridian. On paper, I was just another faceless drone assigned to reconcile travel expenses, post-injury medication costs, return-to-work subsidies, and severance reimbursements. It was the lowest, most tedious rung of the financial processing ladder. It involved staring at thousands of lines of data for 8 hours a day. It was exactly where I needed to be to watch the pennies disappear. My objective was strictly professional when I accepted the assignment. I was there to write a risk assessment report, but that detachment evaporated the very first week I logged into their mainframe. For me, this assignment became intensely, furiously personal. 15 years ago, my father fell from a poorly secured scaffolding on a non-union construction site. He shattered his lower lumbar spine and pulverized his right knee. He was a fiercely proud man who had worked with his hands his entire life. And suddenly he was confined to a rented mechanical hospital bed placed right in the middle of our small living room. I remember the sharp, antiseptic smell of the medical supplies mixed with the familiar scent of our old home. The physical pain he endured was agonizing, but it was the financial suffocation that truly broke our family. Because his injury was workplace-related, he was legally entitled to physical therapy and travel reimbursements for the specialized rehabilitation clinic located 45 miles away from our home. But those checks never seemed to arrive intact, if they arrived at all. A reimbursement that was supposed to be for $250 would show up as $180. A $90 claim for mandatory prescription copays would be reduced to $14 without any logical explanation. When my mother would spend 3 hours on hold, waiting for an answer from the claims adjusters, she was always met with a wall of dense, impenetrable corporate jargon. They called the missing money a system adjustment. They called it a reconciliation hold. They cited obscure administrative subclauses printed in font so incredibly small it blurred the eyes. The operators on the phone were trained to be polite but entirely unhelpful, repeating the same scripted phrases until my mother would eventually hang up in tears. My parents were exhausted. My father was fighting a daily battle just to feel a phantom sensation in his legs again, and my mother was working double shifts at a local diner just to keep the electricity running. They simply did not have the energy, the money, or the specialized legal vocabulary to fight a faceless corporate entity over $70 here and $40 there. The system was designed to wear them down, and it worked flawlessly. Eventually, they stopped fighting the adjustments. We sold my father's prized old blue pickup truck just to pay for the gas to get him to his remaining therapy sessions. I remember standing on the front porch, watching the new owner drive that truck out of our driveway, feeling a profound, helpless rage that I was too young and too powerless to do anything about. When I pulled my first batch of rejected claims at Holloway, I saw it, the exact same phrasing, the exact same sterile, legally buffered accounting language that had slowly bled my family dry all those years ago. Reconciliation hold, system adjustment, minor clerical offset. Reading those specific words on my dual computer monitors did not make me hot with anger. It made me ice cold. It brought absolute, terrifying clarity. This was not a software glitch. It was not sloppy bookkeeping caused by overworked clerks. It was a perfectly calibrated predatory model. Holloway was targeting the exact demographic my parents had belonged to. They were preying on injured factory workers struggling with back pain, exhausted widows trying to manage confusing funeral benefits, night shift warehouse packers needing gas money for mandatory doctor visits, and terminated employees waiting desperately for their final, meager payout. Holloway knew these people were too tired, too broken, and too financially desperate to hire a lawyer over a $20 discrepancy. They knew a working-class mother would not take a day off work to contest a $50 processing fee. By the end of my first month inside the building, my daily objective had fundamentally shifted. The Kincaid Meridian corporate buyout was no longer the center of my universe. The risk assessment report was secondary. I realized I was standing directly in the engine room of a massive, automated machine designed to suck the lifeblood out of the most vulnerable people in the labor system. I was watching them steal milk money, and gas money, and basic human dignity, quarter by quarter, dime by dime. From that moment on, I stopped being a neutral observer. I started building a criminal case. I spent my days smiling politely at people like Blake Harlan, nodding at the terrible jokes made by the human resources staff, and quietly tracing the stolen fractions of cents through their complex labyrinth of shadow accounts. Every time I found a hidden pocket of stolen reimbursement funds, I thought of my father's empty parking space where his truck used to be. Every time I identified a fake administrative fee, automatically deducted from a disability check, I thought of my mother crying at the kitchen table over a stack of final notices. I was not just an investigator anymore. I was a debt collector. This was no longer just a job to protect a wealthy corporation from a bad investment. This was a delayed reckoning. I was going to pull the entire structure down around them, and I was going to make sure Holloway paid back every single cent they had taken from thousands of people who had never even been given the dignity of an apology. I spent the first several months building the perfect camouflage. To survive in a corporate ecosystem that feeds on the weak, you have to become utterly unremarkable. I made sure my sedan was the first one in the parking lot at 6:45 every morning. I brewed the break room coffee before the administrative staff arrived. I kept my desk aggressively bland, decorated only with a generic calendar and a company-issued pen holder. More importantly, I became the person everyone could dump their backlog onto. If a senior analyst wanted to leave at 3 in the afternoon on a Friday, I cheerfully offered to take their remaining files. By doing their grunt work, I gained unrestricted access to their processing histories. Within 12 weeks, I was universally regarded as the most reliable, unthreatening, an invisible employee on the floor. That invisibility allowed me to look closely at the targets. The people Holloway was bleeding dry were never the executives with gold-plated health plans. They were the absolute bottom tier of the American workforce. I spent my days reading the desperate appeals of lumber mill workers with shattered lumbar discs, trying to get reimbursed for a 50-mile drive to the only pain specialist their plan covered. I reviewed the meager files of grieving spouses waiting for a one-time funeral disbursement of $2,000. I processed claims for graveyard shift janitors needing a $70 reimbursement for mandatory physical therapy. These were people living check to check, entirely reliant on a system that was secretly designed to starve them. The genius of the Holloway theft was its microscopic scale. If you steal $10,000 from one person, they hire a lawyer. If you steal $4.50 from 50,000 people, they just assume the system is complicated and give up. The core mechanism was a brilliant piece of malicious coding called a reconciliation hold. When a worker submitted a valid claim for, say, $150, the system would automatically approve $142. The remaining $8 would be flagged as a hold pending secondary review. But there was no secondary review. The system was programmed to let that hold sit in a digital purgatory for exactly 90 days. On the 91st day, the hold would silently expire. The money did not revert back to the injured worker. Instead, it was automatically swept into a corporate contingency fund. If they could not use a hold, they used fees. I found thousands of accounts subjected to a $3 paper processing surcharge, a $5 card activation penalty, or a $2.50 fee for updating a mailing address. Every single deduction was mathematically calculated to be just small enough that a rational person would not spend 3 hours on the phone fighting it. But when you aggregated those tiny cuts across the entire regional database, the numbers became monstrous. They were siphoning millions of dollars a year. The next phase of my investigation was tracking where that massive pool of stolen change actually went. It could not just sit in a slush fund. I traced the diverted money as it moved outward, disguised as legitimate corporate overhead. The contingency funds were regularly drained to pay for fictitious consulting contracts, inflated technology vendor invoices, and bogus software licensing fees. If a standard auditor looked at any single invoice, it appeared perfectly mundane. It was only when you zoomed out and saw the entire ecosystem that the money laundering became obvious. Keeping a fraud of this magnitude quiet required a very specific management culture, and Blake Harlan was the perfect warden. He maintained control of our department using the oldest tools in the corporate playbook. He heavily rewarded the willfully ignorant with prime parking spots, catered lunches, and easy promotions. Conversely, he viciously punished curiosity. If a junior clerk dared to ask why a specific batch of medical claims was being shorted, Blake would haul them out to the center of the floor and loudly berate their lack of industry comprehension. If public humiliation did not work, Tessa Boone in Human Resources was the executioner. Tessa had a terrifying talent for weaponizing corporate therapy language. Whenever someone raised an ethical concern, she would pull them into her office and slowly twist the conversation. "We are noticing a real lack of alignment with our core values, and your negative attitude is disrupting the team dynamic," Tessa would say, her voice soft and lethal. Suddenly, reporting a stolen payment became a hostile workplace violation. People learned to keep their heads down and process the files as instructed. Then there was Reed Fallon, the director of financial control. Reed was the digital janitor. His entire job was to manually edit the transaction descriptions in the database to erase any footprint of intentional theft. If a batch of claims was flagged by an external software update, Reed would quietly change the deduction codes to make it look like an isolated software glitch. But Reed was arrogant, and arrogant people leave mistakes. I found his mistake in the basement copy room. Holloway still used a massive, screeching dot matrix printer to run the nightly physical backup ledgers at 2 a.m. These physical logs were considered an obsolete formality, completely ignored by the digital-first management team. One morning, arriving early as usual, I pulled the massive stack of green-banded paper from the output tray. Out of pure instinct, I compared the physical printout of the Regional Contingency Fund from the night before to the digital dashboard displayed on my monitor at 8 in the morning. They did not match. The digital dashboard showed a fund total that was exactly $412 less than the physical printout. The next day, the discrepancy was $380. The physical paper captured the exact moment the money pooled together. But before the morning shift started, someone was manually skimming the top off the digital ledger and moving it to an off-book account. Someone was intervening in the dead of night. By the end of my 8th month in the cubicle, the picture was brutally clear. I had the mechanics of the theft. I had the money trail. I had the 3 direct operators, Blake managing the floor, Tessa enforcing the silence, and Reed washing the digital tracks. But as I dug deeper into the hidden architecture of the accounting software, I hit a steel wall. Every single malicious script, every automated hold, and every off-book transfer required a master administrative override. Blake, Tessa, and Reed were just middle management thugs following a blueprint. They did not have the access or the intelligence to build the machine. Whenever I managed to unearth the deepest approval logs for the fraudulent software patches, the authorization line was never a full name. It was just 2 initials, floating like a ghost in the code. GV. Whoever GV was, they were sitting far above the Columbus regional office. They were the architect of the entire predatory model, and they wielded so much power that even Blake Harlan never dared to speak their name aloud. Finding GV was the final key. But I was running out of time. The Kincaid Meridian acquisition was moving fast, and the people at the top were getting ready to burn the evidence, take their massive buyout bonuses, and disappear into the corporate ether. The click of the disconnected call hung in the conference room like the final toll of an iron bell. Blake Harlan stared at the sleek black phone resting on the mahogany table, his brain struggling to process the seismic shift in power. He had brought me in here because a routine internal security sweep had flagged my user identification code accessing the main server at 2 in the morning the previous Sunday. It was a minor anomaly, completely circumstantial. But Blake was a man living in perpetual fear of discovery. Instead of initiating a quiet, standard administrative review, he had opted for his favorite weapon, public execution. He wanted to terrify a low-level contract worker into signing a confession, effectively framing me as a disgruntled employee stealing proprietary data. If I had signed that paper, every piece of evidence I had gathered over the past 8 months would have been instantly discredited. Holloway would have neatly pinned the entire regional fraud scheme on a rogue clerk, fired me, and walked away clean before the acquisition auditors arrived. But Blake had miscalculated profoundly. Before Blake could even open his mouth to demand an explanation, the building reacted. It started with a subtle, simultaneous mechanical click echoing through the walls. The electronic badge reader next to the conference room door, which normally glowed a comforting green, suddenly flashed violently red and emitted a sharp, continuous warning tone. Out on the main floor, a collective gasp rose from the sea of cubicles. Through the glass walls, I watched as every single computer monitor in the regional department simultaneously blinked to black. A second later, they rebooted, displaying nothing but a stark, solid white screen bearing the Kincaid Meridian corporate crest and a block of text citing a federal data preservation mandate. The entire digital nervous system of the Columbus office had just been severed and put on life support. "What did you just do?" Blake whispered, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of the smug executive authority he had projected just 10 minutes ago. He lunged for his own mobile device, wildly stabbing at the screen to call building security, but his phone displayed the exact same stark white lockdown message. The secure executive elevators at the far end of the hall, the ones requiring a special platinum-tier keycard, ground to an abrupt halt between floors, locking the upper management exactly where they were. Then came the suits. The heavy double doors at the main entrance of the department swung open with enough force to bang aggressively against the drywall. A highly coordinated team flooded into the room. They did not look like local police. They were infinitely more precise and terrifying. It was Kincaid Meridian's elite acquisition strike force. Leading the pack were a dozen digital forensics specialists carrying heavy shock-proof server cases, flanked by corporate security personnel in sharp dark suits. Right behind them was a team of brutal high-priced acquisition attorneys clutching stacks of court-approved injunctions. They fanned out across the floor with terrifying efficiency. There was no shouting, no dramatic arrests, just the cold, systematic dismantling of a corrupt enterprise. In the chaos, Tessa Boone, the human resources director who sat frozen next to Blake just moments ago, finally snapped out of her paralytic shock. Realizing the conference room door was unlocked, she slipped out and sprinted in her expensive heels toward the human resources administrative suite. She knew exactly what she had to destroy. Locked in her bottom drawer were the fabricated performance reviews and heavily doctored behavioral warnings she had used to threaten, silence, and terminate any employee who had dared to ask questions about the missing reimbursement funds. If Kincaid Meridian found those files, she was looking at felony extortion. Tessa burst into the copy room and shoved a massive stack of manila folders toward the industrial crosscut shredder. She managed to slam her hand on the power switch, but before a single piece of paper touched the spinning steel blades, a large, heavy hand clamped down firmly over her wrist. A Kincaid security officer, who had tracked her desperate sprint, simply pulled the power cord from the wall, gently took the folders from her trembling hands, and pointed her toward a holding area. On the other side of the floor, Reed Fallon, the director of financial control, was fighting his own losing battle. The moment his dual monitors flashed white, Reed dropped to his knees beneath his desk, desperately trying to hardwire his personal laptop directly into the local Ethernet port. He needed 3 minutes. Just 3 minutes to run a localized wipe protocol and erase his deeply buried history of manually editing transaction codes and altering the nightly ledger entries. His fingers flew across his keyboard, sweat dripping onto the keys. As he finally bypassed the local block, he hit the execute command to scrub the drive. A dialog box popped up on his screen, but it was not a confirmation of deletion. It was a customized message from my forensic team at Sterling Vale. It politely informed him that his entire workstation, including his encrypted shadow drives, had been actively mirrored and backed up to an off-site server continuously for the past 6 weeks. Reed stared at the screen, his hands falling limply to his sides, realizing his digital bleach was entirely useless. The stains were already immortalized. I remained seated in the conference room, watching the surgical raid unfold through the glass. The senior analysts who had actively avoided my gaze earlier were now clustered together near the break room, their faces pale masks of sheer shock. They watched as the invisible, unremarkable woman who had spent months quietly fixing their coffee machine and processing their overflow files sat calmly amidst the corporate carnage. I had not called for a lifeline. I had not begged for a lawyer like a terrified subordinate. I had simply given the green light for an ambush that had been lying in wait beneath their feet for months. I was the architect of their immediate destruction, and the realization washed over the bullpen in a wave of stunned, breathless silence. 2 corporate security officers finally stepped into the conference room. They did not ask Blake to stand. Their posture made it abundantly clear he had no choice. They instructed him to leave his phone, his keys, and his company badge on the table. He was being escorted off the premises immediately, pending federal indictments for organized financial fraud. As they flanked him and guided him toward the door, the reality of his total ruin finally settled into his bones. His career, his unvested stock options, his industry reputation, all of it was gone, incinerated in less than 10 minutes. But Blake Harlan was a creature born of a very specific, vicious ecosystem. Even in total defeat, he clung to the hierarchy of his corruption. As he reached the glass doorway, he stopped and planted his expensive leather shoes firmly on the carpet. The security guards grabbed his biceps to pull him forward, but Blake twisted his head, locking his dark eyes onto mine one last time. His face was entirely devoid of the manufactured corporate empathy he had worn earlier. It was a mask of pure, unfiltered venom. "You think you are so incredibly smart," Blake hissed. his voice dropping into a low, guttural register that barely carried over the noise of the active raid outside. "You think you won today, but you only caught my floor. You have absolutely no idea who actually signs those numbers." He smiled, a dark, jagged expression that sent a momentary chill down my spine. Then, the guards pulled him away, leading him out through the maze of cubicles and directly into the waiting consequences of his own greed. I stayed perfectly still in my chair, staring at the empty doorway. He was trying to rattle me, to leave a parting shot meant to make me feel small, but all he had done was confirm what I already knew. Blake, Tessa, and Reed were just loyal soldiers executing a playbook. The real war, the one against the ghost in the machine, was just beginning. The forensic sweep of the Columbus office yielded exactly what our team anticipated, up to a very rigid, impenetrable ceiling. We secured terabytes of encrypted emails, shadow ledgers, and actively deleted transaction histories. We possessed ironclad, undeniable proof of a coordinated financial fraud ring operating seamlessly at the regional level. But the digital ladder had been sawed off deliberately right above Blake Harlan's head. Every time our tracing software reached the executive tier, searching for the true architect of the system, it hit a sophisticated digital firebreak. Kincaid Meridian, thoroughly spooked by the sheer volume of the legal liability we had unearthed in just one morning, officially halted the $800 million acquisition pending a full federal review. That was the procedural victory I had engineered. The psychological reality on the ground, however, was a completely different and far more treacherous battlefield. Silence is a massive corporation's first and most reliable line of defense, but when silence fails to contain a breach, they immediately pivot to noise. Within 48 hours of our raid, the narrative leaked to the local financial press. It was not framed as a triumphant story about uncovering a predatory billing scheme that systematically stole from vulnerable laborers. The public relations spin doctors transformed it into a story about vicious corporate sabotage. The bold headline in the City Business Weekly explicitly branded me as a corporate plant. They spun the suddenly halted merger as a deliberate, bad faith tactic by Kincaid Meridian, claiming they used a spy to artificially devalue Holloway benefit systems just before a hostile takeover. Suddenly, the hundreds of administrative workers in my building facing imminent layoffs due to the frozen deal were pointing their fingers directly at me. The very people whose pensions and salaries were being secretly siphoned by their own bosses were now thoroughly convinced that I was the villain who had single-handedly destroyed their livelihoods. My former cubicle neighbors, the people I had spent nearly a year sitting beside, fractured into two distinct and equally hostile camps. Half of them looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, feeling deeply betrayed that the quiet, helpful woman who processed their overflow files and brought pastries on Friday mornings was actually a financial mercenary wearing a wire. The other half were paralyzed by absolute, suffocating terror. They spent their days frantically reviewing their own past data entries, terrified that their routine, unquestioning compliance with Blake's daily orders now made them unintentional accomplices to federal wire fraud. I was completely isolated. I learned a very hard lesson that week. Doing the right thing inside a profoundly corrupt ecosystem does not make you a celebrated hero. It makes you an exile. Then came the legal counterstrike. Blake Harlan did not rely on a standard corporate defense attorney. He hired Claire Duval. Duval was a notoriously ruthless defense lawyer who specialized in high-stakes, white-collar exoneration, primarily by way of complete character assassination. She did not bother to argue the forensic data my team had collected. She strategically attacked my motive. In a perfectly orchestrated press statement held on the steps outside the federal courthouse, Duval painted me as an unstable, deeply grieving daughter unable to separate reality from trauma. She had somehow dug up the 15-year-old worker's compensation file belonging to my father. She stood in front of a dozen cameras and declared that I was acting on a deeply ingrained, irrational personal vendetta against the entire insurance industry. She accused me of deliberately manipulating isolated procedural technicalities to frame innocent middle managers, making the systematic fraud look like nothing more than the fabricated revenge fantasy of a traumatized woman. I desperately needed a human anchor. I needed someone inside the Holloway machine who could verbally confirm the malicious intent behind the manipulated numbers to counter Duval's narrative. The only visible crack in their defensive armor was Lena Torres. Lena was the senior supervisor of payment reconciliation. She was a quiet, deeply anxious woman in her late 50s who had spent a decade rubber-stamping the exact corrupted ledgers I was investigating. I knew Lena possessed a functioning conscience because she was the one who had secretly hoarded the original night prints from the basement, knowing they contradicted the morning screens. I finally cornered her in the damp, echoing concrete of the underground parking garage 2 days after the initial raid. She was leaning heavily against the concrete pillar next to her 12-year-old sedan, smoking a cigarette with violently trembling hands. When I approached her, she did not try to run away. She just looked incredibly tired, as if the weight of the building above us was pressing directly onto her shoulders. "They are going to say I knew about everything," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the garage ventilation fans. "They are going to tell the federal prosecutors that I built the automated holds. You did not build those holds." "Lena," I said, keeping my physical distance so I would not spook her. My tone soft but completely firm. "But you saw them operating. You watched those financial holds expire day after day. You kept the physical paper prints in your desk because you knew the digital dashboard they forced you to present every morning was a complete lie." Lena closed her eyes tightly, and a single tear cut a path through the cheap foundation makeup on her cheek. "I had actual people calling me on my direct office extension, Morgan. Men with crushed spines crying into the receiver because they were short $40 for the gas they desperately needed to drive to the physical therapy clinic. Exhausted widows begging me to explain why a mandatory processing fee ate into their husband's funeral disbursement. Every single time I escalated a complaint, Blake pulled me into his office and told me it was just a routine system error. He told me to read the approved corporate script and hang up the phone. I have 2 kids in college right now. What was I supposed to do?" "You can tell the truth right now," I urged her, stepping slightly closer. "I have the entire Kincaid legal team ready and waiting. If you give a sworn deposition explicitly connecting Blake's verbal orders to the missing funds, we can protect you. We can grant you full legal immunity." She looked at me for a long time, the gray ash dropping from her burning cigarette onto the damp concrete floor. She finally gave a small, defeated nod. "Give me until tomorrow morning. I need to call my daughters first and explain this to them." I believed her. That was my greatest tactical mistake. When I arrived at her garden-style apartment complex the very next morning, accompanied by 2 Kincaid lawyers ready to take her official statement, the front door was unlocked. The living room was perfectly clean, but the air felt entirely hollow. The bedroom closets were half empty. She had not reported to work, and calls to her mobile phone went straight to a generic automated voicemail. I walked alone into her small kitchen, resting directly on the center of the cheap laminate counter. Pressed down by a heavy ceramic coffee mug was a torn piece of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was rushed, jagged with sheer panic. I picked it up and read the single sentence she had left behind. "You pulled the weeds, but the roots are outside this building." I stood motionless in the empty kitchen, the heavy silence of the abandoned apartment pressing tightly against my ears. I realized then the true, terrifying scale of the danger I had invoked. The aggressive raid on the Columbus office had not crippled the enemy in the slightest. It had merely severed a highly disposable limb. Blake Harlan and his immediate cronies were just the shock absorbers for something massive, deeply entrenched, and heavily shielded. By striking the local office, I had not destroyed the machine at all. I had simply forced the real architects hiding safely in the shadows to begin their counterattack. Nolan and I locked ourselves in a windowless conference room on the 14th floor of the Kincaid Meridian corporate headquarters. We had the mirrored server drives, the encrypted backups, and an entire wall of whiteboards. We were systematically building the chain of custody for the stolen funds. But on the 3rd day of our deep dive, the architecture of our ironclad case began to silently fracture. It started with a microscopic inconsistency. Nolan was cross-referencing a digital snapshot of the Regional Contingency Fund taken during the second week of October. I held the corresponding physical dot matrix printout I had smuggled out of the basement. I read the approval timestamp aloud, 4:32 in the morning. Nolan shook his head, staring at the glowing monitor. His digital snapshot read, 4:36 in the morning, a 4-minute deviation. In the world of high-frequency corporate accounting, 4 minutes is an eternity. We pulled another file. A disability disbursement logged on paper at 2:15 in the afternoon appeared on the digital mirror at 2:19. It was a slight, almost imperceptible drag in the system clock, but it was applied retroactively to thousands of files. Someone was systematically rewriting the back-end metadata to create a chain of synthetic contradictions. Claire Duvall, Blake's ruthless defense attorney, did not wait for the dust to settle. By noon the following Tuesday, she filed a devastating motion with the Federal Oversight Committee. She weaponized our own data against us. Duvall claimed that the timestamp discrepancies were undeniable proof that I had maliciously altered the data after I was discovered by Blake's internal security sweep. She spun a brilliant, lethal narrative I was a desperate corporate spy caught in the act, trying to doctor the evidence to retroactively justify my illegal intrusion. She made my pristine evidence look dirty, chaotic, and entirely unreliable. I sat in the glow of the monitors long after Nolan went home, tracing the digital signatures of the alterations. The Holloway network was frozen solid by the legal injunction. Nobody inside that building could change a single comma. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach as the tracer program mapped the point of origin. The alterations were not coming from Columbus. They were originating from an IP address mapped directly to Kincaid Meridian's secure data room, the inner sanctum of the acquisition team. We had a mole breathing the exact same air as us, working quietly to sabotage the investigation from the inside. The paranoia settled into my bones like a deep winter chill. I started taking the stairs instead of the elevator. I checked the reflection in my laptop screen to see who was walking behind me. Just past 11 o'clock on a rainy Thursday night, my burner phone buzzed against the surface of my kitchen island. It was an automated text message containing a 9-digit code for a secure package locker at the Central Transit Station. I drove through the slick, empty streets, parked 2 blocks away, and walked to the glowing yellow lockers. Inside Bay 42 was a single, unmarked manila envelope. It contained a photocopied sheet of a reconciliation hold from 3 years ago and a torn piece of paper with a handwritten address for a 24-hour copy and print shop located on the ragged industrial edge of the city. Underneath the address were 2 words: "Midnight, come alone." The print shop was a harsh oasis of fluorescent light, humming violently in a sea of abandoned warehouses. The air inside smelled of warm ozone and cheap toner ink. Standing in the back aisle, partially hidden behind a display of binding coils, was Lena Torres. She looked like a ghost. Her skin was the color of old parchment, and her hands were jammed deep into the pockets of a heavy wool coat, shaking so violently the fabric vibrated. "Lena," I said softly, stepping into the aisle. She flinched as if I had struck her. "They are rewriting the past. Morgan," she whispered rapidly, her eyes darting toward the front glass windows. "The files you mirrored, they are poisoning them. They have administrative keys that do not exist on any official registry. They are changing the source code of the entire decade." "I know," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "They are in the data room at Kincaid. I need to know how they are routing the money before they erase the destination entirely." Lena pulled a thick, spiral-bound notebook from her coat pocket. The edges were frayed, and the cardboard cover was bent. She ripped out a dozen pages and shoved them into my chest. "The digital files are useless now," she breathed, her voice cracking with pure terror. "But they cannot hack paper. These are my personal logs." I wrote down the actual transit codes every single quarter. They rename the contingency funds every 3 months to make it look like regular vendor payments. In quarter 1, it was designated as a software licensing fee. By quarter 3, it was categorized as a mandatory compliance audit reserve. It is all the same stolen money. just wearing different masks. I looked down at the frantic, cramped handwriting. It was the Rosetta Stone of their laundering operation. It bridged the gap between the stolen pennies and the corporate accounts. "You have to come with me to the federal prosecutor tomorrow," I told her, looking back up. "With this notebook and your testimony, their digital manipulation will not matter." A pair of blindingly bright headlights swept across the front windows of the print shop. A massive black sports utility vehicle rolled to a slow, deliberate halt right at the edge of the illuminated parking lot. The engine idled with a low, threatening growl. The tinted windows were completely opaque. Lena let out a strangled sob. "I cannot do this. I am so sorry." Before I could grab her arm, she bolted down the opposite aisle, pushed through the heavy metal fire exit at the back of the store, and vanished into the rain-soaked alleyway. I stood there clutching the torn notebook pages, the black vehicle idling outside like a silent predator. It did not move until I finally walked out the front door, at which point it slowly pulled away, melting into the dark streets. The trap did not snap shut that night. It snapped shut at 9 o'clock the following morning. I was summoned to the Kincaid Meridian Executive Boardroom. Nolan was already there, looking physically sick. Sitting at the head of the long glass table was the chairman of the Internal Oversight Committee. Projected on the massive screen behind him was high-definition security footage. It was the interior of the 24-hour print shop. The camera angle was perfect. It showed me standing in the back aisle, engaging in a tense, secretive conversation with the key witness of the Holloway investigation in the middle of the night. It clearly showed Lena handing me a stack of papers outside of any legal protocol. "Claire Duval's office couriered this to the board at dawn," the chairman said, his voice flat and devoid of any sympathy. "Along with a formal complaint of witness tampering and evidence fabrication." "She reached out to me," I fired back, my voice echoing sharply in the cavernous room. "She brought me a handwritten ledger that proves their team is actively destroying the digital chain of custody. It proves you are conducting unrecorded, unsupervised meetings with highly vulnerable witnesses." The chairman interrupted coldly. "It looks exactly like you are coaching her testimony and exchanging unverified documents to patch the holes in your own corrupted data. You have a mole in your own data room," I pleaded, stepping toward the table. "Look at the IP access logs. They are setting this up. The media is currently crucifying this firm for corporate espionage." "Ms. Allen," the chairman stated, folding his hands. "And now the defense is accusing our lead investigator of dirty tactics. The integrity of this entire acquisition is hanging by a thread. Kincaid Meridian must preserve complete independence and distance from any shadow of misconduct." He did not need to finish the sentence. The verdict was already decided. "Effective immediately, you are suspended from all direct activity, analysis, and communication regarding the Holloway file," he declared. "You will surrender your security access, your laptops, and the documents you procured last night. You are entirely off the board." I placed the torn notebook pages onto the cold glass table. As I walked out of the boardroom, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The invisible architect behind the fraud did not need to win an argument about the truth. They did not need to prove they were innocent. They simply needed to smear enough mud on my reputation so that the board would discard me. They had successfully turned the hunter into a dirty cop, ensuring my voice would no longer be the blade that cut their throat. Being severed from the Kincaid Meridian servers felt like having my optic nerve surgically cut. I was suddenly blind in a war I had started. The corporate board had stripped me of my credentials, my laptops, and every digital asset I had painstakingly compiled, but they made one fundamental error. They assumed my entire investigation existed on a hard drive. They forgot that I had spent months sitting in a gray cubicle, pretending to take meeting minutes while actually handwriting an encyclopedic record of their crimes. I pushed my coffee table to the edge of my living room and covered the hardwood floor with 5 black spiral-bound notebooks. These were the only things the Kincaid lawyers had not confiscated, simply because they did not know they existed. With the corrupted digital mirroring out of the picture, analog memory was my only untouched weapon. I spent 3 days crawling over the pages, cross-referencing dates and fund titles. Without the noise of the digital dashboard, the mechanical rhythm of the fraud became incredibly obvious. I noticed a distinct, repeating cycle. Every time the stolen contingency fund swelled past a specific threshold, usually around $250,000, the electronic records were scrubbed clean by the automated system. But my handwritten notes, copied directly from the margins of the physical dot matrix printouts before Lena Torres was forced to hide them, retained a tiny string of alphanumeric source code. At the end of every single scrub sequence, sitting quietly in the margin, were those two initials, GV. On the fourth night of my suspension, a sharp knock rattled my front door. It was Nolan Pierce. He was not wearing his usual sharp suit. He wore a faded jacket, and he looked like a man who had not slept in a week. He stepped inside, refusing to take off his coat. "I am not supposed to be here," Nolan said, his voice low and tight. "If Kincaid's security catches me talking to you, I lose my license." "Why are you here, Nolan?" I asked, standing by the sea of notebooks. "To tell you that you were right," he replied grimly. "The mirrored server at headquarters is entirely compromised. The digital timestamps are actively shifting right in front of my eyes, and the network administrators claim they cannot trace the root command. The mole is operating at the executive tier. We have lost the digital battlefield. Morgan, they own the history now." "They own the digital history," I corrected him, pointing down at the floor. "But they cannot retroactively hack ink." I walked Nolan through the pattern. I pointed to the initials GV. I reminded him of a peculiar behavioral quirk I had observed in Blake Harlan during my undercover months. Blake was an arrogant tyrant who loved to assert dominance, but there was exactly one scenario that made him go completely dead silent. Whenever the Columbus office received a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the seal of the National Benefit Standards Council, the private regulatory body that dictated operational compliance for the entire insurance industry, Blake would snatch it from the mail cart himself and lock his office door. The letters were always classified as process standardization updates. I flipped to a page detailing a third-party transit vendor called MarrowCard Mobility. "Look at this," I told Nolan. "MarrowCard is the pooling station. Before the stolen reimbursements hit the disguised reserve funds, they are routed through this specific prepaid transit card vendor as an activation hold. It acts as a financial airlock. If we can prove who designed this specific airlock, we bypass the digital corruption entirely." Nolan rubbed his temples. "Morgan, to prove who built the architecture, you need the original system migration documents. Holloway upgraded their entire processing mainframe years ago. The physical blueprints for that transition were supposed to be shredded after 5 years by federal mandate." That was when a seemingly meaningless memory crystallized in my mind. Earl Benton. He was the grumpy, semi-retired head of the internal mailroom who had complained to me constantly about the sheer volume of paper they used to handle. "The year 2014, I said aloud, the realization hitting me. Earl told me about the big server migration in the fall of 2014. He complained that management was too cheap to hire a secure shredding service for the old physical ledgers. Instead, they boxed up hundreds of pallets of raw paper vouchers and shipped them to a deep storage facility out of state to rot." "Where?" Nolan demanded, his eyes suddenly sharp. "Kentucky," I answered. "A subterranean limestone facility near Louisville. If the scheduled destruction order was delayed, the genesis code of this entire monster is sitting in a cardboard box." We drove through the night, pushing Nolan's car to the limit down the dark interstate. We reached the storage facility just after dawn. It was a massive, hollowed-out cavern of limestone, repurposed into a subterranean labyrinth for corporate skeletons. The air inside was freezing and smelled intensely of damp earth and decaying paper. Nolan used a Kincaid corporate credential that had not yet been revoked to bluff our way past the front desk, claiming an emergency audit hold. The clerk handed us a map and pointed us towards Sector 4. We spent 6 agonizing hours ripping through towers of moldering cardboard boxes. My hands were black with dust and age. We were looking for the specific palette labeled for the system architecture transition. Just past noon, my box cutter sliced open a heavy, water-stained carton. Inside were thick, brass-bound logbooks and heavy plastic binders. I pulled out a red binder marked with a faded operational label. I flipped it open. There it was, the original blueprint. It was a hand-drawn flowchart detailing exactly how a standard medical reimbursement hold could be algorithmically diverted, pooled into Marrow card mobility, and then legally renamed as a contingency reserve. It was the exact predatory mechanism I had spent nearly a year trying to expose, laid out not as an error, but as a deliberate, calculated business strategy. Attached to the front of the blueprint was a formal transition memo. At the bottom of the page was a signature, not just initials this time, a full, elegant, aggressive signature executed in heavy black ink, Graham Voss. I stared at the name, my breath pluming in the cold, damp air of the cave. The pieces locked together with terrifying precision. Graham Voss was not some phantom executive hiding on the top floor of the Holloway building. He had not worked at Holloway for years. "Nolan," I whispered, handing him the binder. Nolan read the signature, and the color drained completely from his face. "This is impossible." It was not impossible. It was a masterpiece of corporate engineering. Graham Voss had built the predatory machine at Holloway, proved that it worked flawlessly, and then he left. He had climbed the ladder and was now the sitting vice president of the National Benefit Standards Council. The man who wrote the loophole had become the regulator who wrote the rulebook. He was the one sending those process standardization letters to Blake. Voss was teaching the entire American benefits industry exactly how to build the same machine, and how to use industry-approved language to make sure no auditor, no lawyer, and no injured worker would ever see it. Sitting on the hardwood floor of my dimly lit apartment, entirely surrounded by the water-stained binders we had dragged out of the Kentucky limestone cave, the sheer, terrifying scale of the corruption finally snapped into sharp focus. Graham Voss was not merely a parasite temporarily attached to Holloway benefit systems. He was the host organism. By elevating himself to the powerful position of vice president at the National Benefit Standards Council, Voss had achieved the ultimate, unassailable corporate camouflage. He was the man who literally defined what was considered legal and normal. I spent 48 exhausting hours cross-referencing the analog architectural blueprints against publicly available regulatory filings from across the country. The operational guidelines Voss authored for the Industry Council were a masterclass in sanitized, institutional theft. He utilized incredibly dense, bureaucratic phrases like acceptable margin of processing friction and automated reserve allocation to legally justify the exact same skimming operation across the entire healthcare landscape. Holloway was just the loudest alarm bell because it was currently undergoing an $800 million acquisition audit. As I dug through the public dockets, I found 3 other massive claims processing firms employing the exact same contingency fund structures and microscopic adjustment fees to systematically squeeze dry the accounts of their most vulnerable claimants. Voss had not just committed fraud, he had successfully franchised it. This horrific revelation perfectly explained the sheer, reckless arrogance Blake Harlan had displayed during my ambush in the glass conference room. When Blake aggressively slid that termination agreement across the mahogany table, he was not acting out of isolated, panicked desperation. He was operating under a concrete, ironclad guarantee. He dared to publicly force me to sign a false confession because he firmly believed, or rather had been explicitly promised, that the invisible hand above him would always aggressively sanitize the blast zone. It also completely demystified the terrifying digital gaslighting Nolan and I had experienced at Kincaid Meridian. Voss did not just have a single, isolated mole inside our secure data room. He had deeply embedded loyalists scattered throughout the entire corporate buyout chain and the national data benchmarking network. They possessed the highest administrative privileges across multiple platforms, granting them the terrifying power to seamlessly alter timestamps, rewrite historical transaction descriptions, and disguise systematic larceny as routine technical glitches. They were the invisible janitors of the financial world. But every brilliant architect has someone who carries their blueprints. Every powerful executive has an assistant who schedules their clandestine meetings and manually files their raw, unfiltered correspondence before the lawyers sanitize it. I dug frantically through the yellowed human resources rosters buried in the Kentucky boxes until my blackened finger stopped on the exact name I needed. Mara Devlin. She was listed as the senior executive assistant to Graham Voss during the critical 2-year window when the holding funds were initially engineered and deployed. But when I ran her name through the standard background check databases using my burner laptop, she was an absolute ghost. She had resigned abruptly 7 years ago and systematically scrubbed her entire digital existence from the internet. There was no social media footprint, no updated property tax records, and no forwarding corporate email address. She had vanished with a level of precision that screamed of deep, paralyzing fear. I spent 3 agonizing days tracking down a defunct landline number attached to an obscure post office box in a rural county 200 miles north of the city. I called the number and left a highly specific, cryptic message referencing the exact file nomenclature Voss used in the 2014 system migration. I did not leave my name. I just left the code and waited. Late on a Tuesday evening, my prepaid phone vibrated against the kitchen counter. It was an automated routing service masking the caller's true location. When the voicemail clicked over, I heard a woman's voice, tight with years of accumulated paranoia and exhaustion. "You are looking at the wrong ledger entirely," Mara said, her tone hushed and entirely devoid of an introduction. "You are looking at the operational accounts, but the holding pens never stay full. If you hold on to the water for too long, the dam breaks. You have to look at where the water flows when the quarter ends. Do not trust the federal oversight channels. Do not hand anything over to the official review boards. He has eyes on every single one of them. You need to look at the intermediate escrow." The line went dead with a sharp click. There was no goodbye, just a desperate warning thrown into the dark. Intermediate escrow. It was a term rarely utilized in standard, day-to-day claims processing. I tore through my handwritten notebooks, completely bypassing the regional Holloway accounts, and started tracing the external vendor payouts. Mara was pointing me toward a completely forgotten, highly insulated financial layer, the third-party intermediary insurance underwriters. These were the invisible, silent companies that temporarily held massive sums of liability capital to ensure the processing firms remained solvent during catastrophic claim years. I managed to locate a deeply buried 10-year-old physical backup log from an underwriter based out of Delaware. When the stolen pennies and dimes from the injured workers swelled inside the Holloway contingency funds at the end of every fiscal quarter, they were not immediately booked as standard, taxable revenue. That would have triggered an automatic federal audit. Instead, they were quietly wired into a blind escrow account managed entirely by the intermediary underwriter. Once the stolen money was safely parked in the dark void of the escrow, it was legally washed clean. It was then injected back into the Holloway parent company under entirely different, highly respectable classifications. I meticulously traced the routing numbers and watched the stolen gas money of crippled factory workers magically transform into massive, untraceable executive bonuses. More disgustingly, the funds were routinely reclassified as leadership retention fees and strategic growth capital. This was the true, monstrous brilliance of Graham Voss. The money was not just lining the pockets of middle managers, it was being actively weaponized to artificially inflate the entire valuation of the enterprise. By hiding the stolen funds as legitimate auxiliary profit, Voss had successfully tricked massive conglomerates like Kincaid Meridian into paying a massive premium for a company built entirely on a foundation of systemic theft. The victims were funding the very executives who were destroying their lives. I finally saw the entire beast in all its horrifying glory. It was breathtaking in its cruelty and its mechanical scale. It was a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of white-collar predation that stretched far beyond the glass walls of the Columbus office, contaminating the very institutions designed to police it. I held the irrefutable, analog proof in my deeply stained hands. I possessed the transition signatures, the routing maps, and the hidden escrow accounts. But as I sat completely alone in my cold apartment, listening to the rain beat against the windows, the bitter, suffocating irony of my situation washed over me like a physical weight. I had finally solved the impossible puzzle. I had cornered the monster, but the corporate board had already stripped me of my voice. I was officially suspended from my firm, securely locked out of the building, heavily discredited by the national financial media as a bitter saboteur, and legally barred from presenting my findings to anyone who possessed the actual power to act on them. I possessed the weapon to end the war, but I was entirely forbidden from pulling the trigger. The emergency injunction hearing was convened on a bleak Thursday morning in a cavernous vase, wood-paneled room in the federal commercial courthouse. The stakes within those four walls were absolute. Kincaid Meridian was petitioning the presiding judge to formally terminate the $800 million acquisition contract, place Holloway Benefit Systems under immediate receivership, and refer the entire corporate leadership to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive wool suits and cold sweat. And I, the very architect who had painstakingly built this massive case from the ground up, was relegated to the very last row of the public gallery. I sat on a hard wooden bench, wearing a simple gray blazer, completely stripped of my corporate credentials and security clearances. I was legally barred from approaching the plaintiff tables. I was forced to watch my own war unfold from the cheap seats. The paralyzing, suffocating helplessness I felt in that room tasted far more bitter than any insult Blake Harlan had ever spat in my face during my forced termination. Claire Duval, the high-priced and notoriously aggressive defense attorney representing Blake and the Holloway Executive Board, was holding court. She was masterfully painting Kincaid Meridian as a predatory conglomerate attempting to manufacture a fake data scandal simply to break a legally binding commercial contract. The Kincaid lawyers, severely handicapped by my forced suspension and the actively corrupted digital evidence on their mirrored servers, were losing ground by the hour. The defense was winning by weaponizing the confusion. Then, Duval called her star witness to the stand. The heavy oak doors near the front of the courtroom swung open, and Lena Torres walked slowly down the center aisle. A collective, quiet gasp echoed from the Kincaid side of the room. Lena looked like a hollow, fragile shell of the woman I had met in the 24-hour copy shop just a week prior. Her skin was ashen, her shoulders were slumped in defeat, and her eyes were fixed firmly on the polished floorboards, deliberately avoiding my gaze in the back row. She had clearly made a desperate, terrifying calculus she was going to bury the absolute truth to save herself from federal prison. Lena took the oath, her voice barely a whisper, and sat heavily in the wooden witness box. Duval approached her with a soft, manufactured smile, designed to project warmth and safety. Under Duval's gentle, meticulously guided questioning, Lena began to systematically dismantle everything we had worked for. She testified that the temporary financial holds placed on the injured workers' accounts were not a malicious theft mechanism at all. She claimed they were simply a standard vendor processing rhythm, a totally legal administrative delay required to ensure compliance with external medical providers. Her voice was flat, robotic, and entirely devoid of the agonizing guilt she had expressed to me in the underground parking garage. She was reciting a script written by someone who had never actually processed a medical claim in their entire life. Then, she made a fatal linguistic error. Duval asked her to explain to the judge exactly how the remaining fractional funds were managed at the end of the standard work week. Lena cleared her throat, gripped the edge of the microphone stand, and recited her next line. Any unmatched pennies remaining in the automated queue undergo a Friday sweep, Lena stated clearly into the silent room. They are temporarily swept into a holding ledger until the following Monday morning to balance the weekly accounting sheet. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. Friday sweep. It was an incredibly common, innocuous-sounding term used constantly in high-level investment banking and corporate finance. But in the grinding trenches of the Columbus Regional Processing Office, nobody ever used that phrase. The floor managers at Holloway aggressively branded that exact weekly procedure as a weekend reconciliation purge. The phrase Friday sweep was entirely foreign to our department's internal lexicon. That meant Lena was not just lying to save her own skin. She had been rigorously coached by someone operating far outside the regional office walls. She was repeating terminology handed down by an executive architect who used Wall Street banking terms instead of blue-collar processing slang. I tore a small piece of paper from the back of a legal pad I had smuggled into the gallery. I grabbed my pen and scribbled a single, urgent sentence. I leaned forward, tapping the shoulder of a junior Kincaid paralegal sitting in the row directly in front of me. I shoved the folded paper into his hand, nodding furiously toward Nolan Pierce, who was sitting at the Kincaid plaintiff table, looking thoroughly defeated. The paralegal scurried down the aisle and slid the note onto the polished mahogany table. I watched Nolan unfold it flat. I watched his eyes scan the words. Ask her exactly who taught her the phrase, Friday sweep. Nolan looked back at me over his shoulder for a fraction of a second, his expression instantly hardening from despair to sharp, focused anger. When Duval finally concluded her direct examination, she offered the witness to the opposing counsel with a smug, victorious nod. Nolan stood up. He did not grab any files. He did not approach the wooden podium. He walked directly toward the witness box, stopping just a few feet away from Lena. The courtroom fell entirely silent, the tensions snapping tight like a wire. Ms. Torres, Nolan began, his voice perfectly calm, lacking any of the theatrical aggression Duval had anticipated. You just testified to this court that your department utilized a protocol called a Friday sweep to manage unmatched funds. Is that correct? Lena blinked rapidly, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden box so tightly her knuckles turned white. Yes, she answered softly. Nolan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a tone of absolute certainty. Ms. Torres, I have personally reviewed thousands of pages of internal communications from your specific department in Columbus. I have read every operational email sent over the past 5 years. The phrase Friday sweep does not appear a single time. Your department refers to that process exclusively as a weekend reconciliation purge. So, I need you to answer one very simple question under penalty of perjury. Who taught you to say Friday sweep? Lena froze completely. The carefully constructed corporate mask shattered into 1,000 pieces in an instant. Her eyes darted wildly toward the defense table, locking onto Blake Harlan, who was suddenly sweating profusely. The silence in the courtroom stretched out for 10 agonizing seconds. It felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Duval jumped aggressively to her feet, shouting a loud objection regarding relevance and badgering the witness, but the judge immediately raised his hand, silencing the defense attorney completely. He turned his severe gaze toward Lena and instructed her to answer the question. Lena looked down at her shaking hands. A single, ragged sob tore through her throat, echoing loudly through the microphone. Under the crushing pressure of the federal oath and the sudden realization that she could not protect the lie, she completely broke. "They told me to say it!" Lena cried, tears finally streaming down her face. Blake Harlan and the corporate lawyers came to my apartment on Tuesday night. They told me if I did not memorize their exact terminology and make the missing money sound like a professional banking error, they would pin the entire regional fraud on me. They promised they would protect my pension if I just read their script. Pandemonium erupted at the defense table. Duval was practically screaming for a recess, while Blake looked like he was about to physically bolt for the heavy oak doors, but Nolan did not retreat. "Ms. Torres," Nolan pressed, his voice cutting clearly over the rising noise in the room. "Do you have any physical proof that these funds were intentionally diverted and not just a processing rhythm?" Lena reached down with trembling hands and pulled her cheap leather purse onto her lap. She unzipped a hidden compartment deep in the interior lining and pulled out the frayed, heavy spiral notebook she had tried to hand me in the copy shop. The real, analog ledger. "They made me leave my original notes at home." She wept, holding the notebook up for the judge to see. "But I hid this one. It has all the original fund rename codes. It has the backdated approval orders they forced me to process. She frantically opened the book to a dog-eared page. There is a handwritten directive in here from 2 years ago. It explicitly orders us to ensure the deductions remain small enough so no injured worker will ever sue, but steady enough to guarantee consistent quarterly revenue. It is signed by GV. The judge slammed his wooden gavel down like a thunderclap, repeatedly demanding order as the Kincaid executives in the front row erupted in a mixture of profound shock and vindicated fury. The notebook was immediately admitted into evidence and handed directly to the court clerk. Blake Harlan was standing up, frantically waving his hands, violently pointing his finger at the ceiling, trying desperately to throw all the blame entirely onto the upper management tiers he had previously sworn to protect. The entire regional facade had collapsed in spectacular, catastrophic fashion. The Columbus office was dead. But as the federal bailiffs moved in to secure the evidence and the judge formally granted Kincaid Meridian their emergency injunction, I remained perfectly still in the back row. I watched Blake drown in his own arrogant hubris, but I felt no immediate sense of triumph. Graham Voss was nowhere in the room. His initials had finally been spoken into the federal record, but the man himself was still a terrifying ghost, entirely insulated by thick layers of corporate bureaucracy and national regulatory committees. The courtroom had just burned to the ground, but everyone in the courtroom understood exactly what I knew: the final, most brutal battle was still waiting for us outside those doors. The night before the final emergency meeting between the Kincaid Meridian Board of Directors and their primary financial lenders, the suffocating silence was finally broken. Mara Devlin, the vanished executive assistant who knew where all the bodies were buried, kept her final promise to me. At exactly midnight, she activated a massive, heavily encrypted data dump. She did not just send it to our isolated forensic team. She set it on a timed release, blasting the files simultaneously to the inbox of every single Kincaid board member, the lead attorneys representing the institutional lenders, the major labor union representatives, and the independent federal monitor assigned by the commercial court. It was the ultimate undeniable kill shot. The data packet contained hundreds of unredacted internal emails, highly classified executive bonus distribution spreadsheets, and the exact routing diagrams mapping the flow of the stolen money from the regional processing floors straight into the intermediate escrow accounts. But the crown jewel of the leak was an audio file. It was a pristine recording of a restricted conference call from 4 years ago. The voice echoing through the speakers was unmistakably Graham Voss. He was not using sanitized, regulatory language. He was explicitly, aggressively instructing the regional directors to maintain what he called the acceptable profit leakage, strictly commanding them to keep the fraudulent contingency funds actively skimming from the workers, because those padded margins were absolutely essential to artificially inflate the company valuation before any future corporate buyout. The moment that audio file hit the servers, the fragile but fear-based loyalty holding the Holloway regional management team together instantly evaporated. Blake Harlan, Tessa Boone, and Reed Fallon realized the terrifying, brutal truth in the middle of the night. They were never valued lieutenants in a brilliant financial empire. They were disposable meat shields. Voss had deliberately positioned them on the absolute front lines, making sure their digital fingerprints were all over the daily regional fraud, specifically so they would take the federal prison sentences while he safely parachuted away with his millions. Survival instinct is a vicious thing. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the phones at the Department of Justice were ringing off the hook. Blake, Tessa, and Reed were all frantically having their respective defense attorneys cold call the federal prosecutors, desperately trying to be the first one to cut a cooperation deal. They turned on Voss with absolute, ruthless speed, ready to sing whatever song the government wanted if it meant saving whatever pathetic scraps of their professional lives remained. When the sun rose on the morning of the final board session, the atmosphere in the Kincaid Meridian Executive Suite was absolutely electric. There was no more gaslighting. There was no more digital manipulation. For the very first time, all the shattered pieces of the puzzle locked together on the massive glass table in perfect, undeniable harmony. Lena Torres's secret physical night prints flawlessly matched the analog subterranean migration blueprints Nolan and I had dragged out of the Kentucky limestone cave. Mara Devlin's escrow data perfectly aligned with the stolen fractional funds. And the final, crushing blow came from the sworn affidavits of Blake, Tessa, and Reed, who had spent the entire dawn giving recorded confessions that pointed their fingers directly and unequivocally at the top of the pyramid. Graham Voss was finally dragged out of the shadows and forced to sit under the glaring fluorescent lights. He wore a bespoke suit that suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He tried to deploy his standard, arrogant corporate defense, smoothly claiming to the board that his memorandums were merely industry standardization recommendations, completely detached from any malicious regional execution. But the room was entirely deaf to his lies. We had his physical signatures on the foundational architecture. We had his direct, verbal commands on tape. We had the irrefutable proof that his personal quarterly performance bonuses perfectly matched the stolen pennies down to the absolute exact cent. His army of digital janitors could no longer rewrite the past when the physical, analog truth was literally piled high in the center of the room. He had nowhere left to hide. The Kincaid Meridian Board of Directors did not just walk away from the $800 million acquisition, they actively dismantled it and weaponized the remains. They immediately pivoted from a standard corporate buyout to a forced, punitive restructuring plan. Holloway Benefit Systems was thrown directly into federal receivership. The clean, functional assets were surgically separated to ensure legitimate medical claims could still be processed. But the massive, corrupted contingency and escrow funds were frozen solid by a federal judge. Kincaid's legal team drafted an ironclad mandate the frozen capital would be utilized to establish a massive, mandatory restitution trust. Every single stolen dime was going to be hunted down and returned to the victims. The fallout was swift and absolute. Blake Harlan was entirely stripped of his title, his unvested stock options, and his lucrative severance package. He signed a lifetime ban preventing him from ever holding a management position in the financial or insurance industry ever again. Tessa Boone and Reed Fallon faced identical lifetime bans, completely exiled from the corporate world. Graham Voss faced the full, crushing weight of the federal government. He was indicted on sweeping racketeering charges, facing decades in federal prison for orchestrating industry-wide fraud, collusion, and severe obstruction of justice. The man who had spent his life writing the rules was finally going to be buried by them. As for me, the Kincaid board formally revoked my suspension within an hour of the meeting. They issued a sweeping public retraction to the financial press, completely restoring my professional reputation and clearing my name, but I did not return to the shadows of forensic auditing. I was officially appointed as the lead director of the newly formed Holloway Restitution Committee. My job was no longer to hunt for the stolen money. My job was to give it back. I spent the next 6 months digging through the deepest, oldest archives. I found the dusty, forgotten files from 15 years ago. I found the names of the men who had worked at the steel fabrication plant alongside my father. I found the widows, the night shift workers, and the injured laborers who had been quietly robbed of their dignity. And one by one, I personally approved their backdated reimbursement checks, complete with a decade and a half of compounded interest. The true climax of this war did not feature the dramatic slam of a judge's wooden gavel or the metallic click of police handcuffs. The most expensive, deeply satisfying moment happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in a sterile, brightly lit conference room. I stood at the head of the table, holding the very first batch of finalized, legally binding restitution letters printed on heavy, watermarked paper. Sitting directly across from me was Blake Harlan. He looked 10 years older, his tailored suit hanging loosely on his frame, his arrogant posture completely shattered. He was holding a cheap plastic pen, forced by the federal mandate to physically sign his own cooperation and total surrender agreement. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults or demand an apology. I simply slid the paperwork across the smooth mahogany surface and watched his hand tremble as he signed his name. I realized in that quiet, echoing room that the absolute sweetest form of revenge is not screaming at the person who humiliated you. It is making them sit there and watch as the massive, untouchable machine they worshipped is completely dismantled, thoroughly audited, and mathematically destroyed right in front of their eyes. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts.